Harold Thompson sat in his old wooden chair on the front porch of his house. The morning sun felt warm on his face. He was 78 years old and had lived in this same house for 32 years. The house was small but comfortable. It had white paint that was starting to peel a little bit. The front yard had grass that Harold cut every week with his old push mower. Harold was a veteran. He had fought in the Korean War when he was just 19 years old. That was a long time ago, but he still remembered it, like it was yesterday. He kept some special stones by his front steps. These stones came from Korea. They reminded him of his friends who died in the war. The stones were gray and smooth. Harold had carried them home in his army bag. The neighborhood used to be quiet and friendly. Harold knew all his neighbors. Mrs. Chen lived next door and always waved hello. Mr. Rodriguez across the street would help Harold fix his car. The kids played in the streets and rode their bikes. Everyone looked out for each other. But things started to change about 5 years ago. New people moved in. They built bigger houses. They drove fancy cars. They did not talk to Harold much. Some of them looked at his house like something was wrong with it. Harold did not understand why they seemed upset. Then the HOA came. HOA means Homeowner Association. Harold had never heard of this before. A man in a suit came to his door one day. The man said Harold's house was now part of the HOA. He said there were new rules everyone had to follow. Harold had to pay money every month to the HOA. He had to keep his house looking a certain way. Harold did not like this idea. He had owned his house for a long time. He paid his taxes. He kept his yard clean. He fixed things when they broke. Why did he need to follow new rules? But the man said Harold had no choice. All the houses in the area were now part of the HOA. The first letter came in the mail 3 weeks later. It was from the HOA. The letter said Harold's mailbox was the wrong color. It needed to be black, not blue. Harold looked at his mailbox. It was blue and had been blue for 15 years. The mail carrier never had any problems with it. But the letter said he had to paint it black or pay a fine. Harold painted the mailbox black. He did not want any trouble. The second letter came 2 weeks after that. This time the HOA said Harold's fence was too tall. The fence was 4 feet high. Harold had built it himself 10 years ago to keep the neighborhood dogs out of his garden. The letter said the fence could only be 3 feet high. Harold would have to make it shorter or pay a fine. Harold was getting angry now. The fence was not hurting anyone. It looked fine. But he did not want to pay the fine. He was living on his army pension and Social Security. Money was tight. So Harold cut the fence down by 1 foot. Then came the third letter. This one made Harold really upset. The HOA said his Korean War memorial stones were not allowed. The letter called them non-compliant lawn ornaments. It said they made the neighborhood look bad. The stones had to be removed within 10 days, or Harold would have to pay a $200 fine. Harold read the letter 3 times. He could not believe it. These stones were special to him. They honored his friends who died in the war. How could anyone say they made the neighborhood look bad? The stones were clean and neat. They sat quietly by his front steps. They did not bother anyone. Harold walked outside and looked at the stones. He remembered his friend Tommy, who died when a bomb exploded near their tent. He remembered Carlos, who got shot trying to help wounded soldiers. He remembered Jim, who froze to death during the cold winter. These stones were all Harold had left to remember them. The letter was signed by someone named Marcus Webb. Harold had never met this person, but Marcus Webb was the chairman of the HOA board. The letter said Harold could come to the next HOA meeting if he wanted to discuss the matter. The meeting was next Thursday at 7 in the evening. Harold decided he would go to this meeting. He would tell these people about the stones. He would explain why they were important. Surely they would understand once they knew the truth. Harold spent the rest of the week thinking about what he would say. He practiced in front of the mirror. He wrote down notes on a piece of paper. He wanted to be ready. Thursday evening came. Harold put on his best shirt and his old army jacket. The jacket still fit pretty well. He had worn it to every important event for the past 30 years. He walked to the community center where the meeting was held. The room was full of people. Harold did not know. They all looked younger than him. They wore nice clothes and talked in loud voices. Harold felt out of place. He sat in a chair in the back row and waited for the meeting to start. Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room. He was a tall man with gray hair and expensive clothes. He talked about property values and community standards. He said the HOA was working hard to make the neighborhood better. Harold listened but did not understand most of what Marcus was saying. Then Marcus started talking about violations. He read a list of houses that were not following the rules. Harold heard his address. Marcus said Harold Thompson refused to remove non-compliant decorations from his property. He said this was lowering property values for everyone. Harold stood up. His legs felt shaky. He raised his hand and said he wanted to speak. The room got quiet. Everyone turned to look at him. Harold felt nervous, but he knew he had to try. Harold walked to the front of the room. He told everyone about the Korean War. He explained about his friends who died. He said the stones were there to honor them. He said the stones were not hurting anyone. He asked if he could please keep them. When Harold finished talking, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus Webb spoke. He said he understood Harold was a veteran. He said everyone respected that. But he said rules were rules. The stones had to go. There were no exceptions. A woman in the front row spoke up. She said Harold's house made her property worth less money. She said she worked hard to afford her house. She did not want to lose money because of Harold's junk. Other people started talking. They said Harold needed to follow the rules like everyone else. They said the neighborhood had standards. They said if they let Harold keep his stones, other people would think they could break rules too. Harold felt his face getting hot. These people did not understand. They did not care about his friends who died. They only cared about money. Harold tried to speak again, but Marcus Webb said the discussion was over. The board would meet next week to decide what to do about Harold's violation. Harold walked home in the dark. He felt sad and angry. He had fought for his country. He had worked hard his whole life. He had been a good neighbor. But now these people wanted to take away the only thing he had left to remember his friends. When Harold got home, he sat on his porch and looked at the stones. The moonlight made them shine a little bit. Harold made a decision. He would not remove the stones. These people could do whatever they wanted to him. But he would not dishonor his friend's memory. Harold did not know that his troubles were just beginning. The next week went by slowly for Harold. Every morning he checked his mailbox, worried about what new letter might be waiting for him. On Wednesday, his fear came true. There was a thick envelope from the HOA. Harold's hands shook a little as he opened it. This letter was longer than the others. It was full of big words that Harold did not understand very well. But the message was clear. The HOA board had made their decision. Harold had 7 days to remove the stones or face legal action. The letter said Harold could be taken to court. He could be forced to pay thousands of dollars in fines and lawyer fees. Harold sat down hard in his kitchen chair. He felt dizzy and scared. He had never been to court before. He did not have thousands of dollars. His army pension and Social Security barely paid for his food and medicine. If the HOA took him to court, he could lose his house. But the letter was not finished. It also said that Harold's house was now being watched for other violations. Any new problems would result in immediate fines. The HOA was taking photos of his property every week. They were making a file about all the things wrong with his house. Harold looked around his kitchen. The paint on the walls was old but clean. The floor had some scratches, but it was swept every day. Harold had always kept his house neat and tidy. What could they possibly find wrong with it? He walked outside to look at his house from the street. The white paint was peeling in a few places. The front steps had a small crack. The mailbox post leaned a little to one side. Harold had never noticed these things before. Now he wondered if the HOA would find fault with them too. That afternoon, Harold's grandson David came to visit. David was 25 years old and worked at a bank in the city. He was smart and always helped Harold with complicated paperwork. Harold showed him the letter from the HOA. David read the letter twice. His face got red with anger. He said the HOA was bullying Harold. He said threatening an old veteran was wrong. David wanted to call a lawyer right away, but Harold said he could not afford a lawyer. David said he would pay for it, but Harold was too proud to let his grandson spend his money on Harold's problems. David had an idea. He said they should go to the local newspaper. Maybe a reporter would write a story about how the HOA was treating a war veteran. People might get angry and help Harold fight back. But Harold said no to this too. He did not want his name in the newspaper. He just wanted to be left alone. After David left, Harold felt more alone than ever. He sat on his porch looking at the memorial stones. He touched each one and remembered his friends. He would not give up without a fight. The next few days were hard for Harold. He noticed cars driving slowly past his house. People he did not know would park across the street and take pictures. A woman with a clipboard came to his door and asked questions about his lawn and his fence. She said she was doing a survey for the neighborhood association. Harold also started noticing his neighbors looking at him differently. Mrs. Chen still waved hello, but she did not stop to talk like she used to. Mr. Rodriguez avoided eye contact when Harold was outside. Some of the newer neighbors would point at Harold's house when they walked by with their dogs. On Saturday morning, Harold was working in his small garden behind the house. He was pulling weeds and watering his tomato plants. Gardening always made him feel better. It reminded him of helping his mother in their garden when he was a boy. Harold heard voices from the front yard. He walked around to see what was happening. 3 people stood on the sidewalk looking at his house. One was Marcus Webb from the HOA. The other 2 were a man and woman Harold had never seen before. Marcus was pointing at different parts of Harold's house. He was talking about property values and community standards. The woman was writing things down in a notebook. The man was taking pictures with a big camera. Harold walked over to them. He asked what they were doing. Marcus smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. He said they were conducting a full property assessment. He said Harold's house had multiple violations that needed to be documented. The woman looked up from her notebook. She pointed to Harold's mailbox and said the post was not straight. She pointed to his front steps and said the crack was a safety hazard. She pointed to his gutters and said they needed cleaning. She pointed to his driveway and said there were oil stains that violated community appearance standards. Harold looked at all these things. Some were true, but they were small problems. His house was old, but it was safe and clean. Harold had lived there for over 30 years without any complaints. Why were these people making such a big deal about tiny imperfections? Marcus Webb spoke up. He said Harold had caused all these problems by refusing to follow HOA rules. He said Harold was being stubborn and selfish. He said Harold did not care about his neighbors or the community. This made Harold angry. He had always been a good neighbor. He had helped people when they needed it. He had never caused any trouble. He told Marcus this was not fair. Marcus laughed. He said fairness had nothing to do with it. He said Harold signed a contract when he bought his house. The contract said he had to follow all HOA rules. If Harold did not like the rules, he could sell his house and move somewhere else. But Harold had not signed any contract with the HOA. The HOA was created years after he bought his house. Harold tried to explain this, but Marcus walked away. He said Harold would be hearing from the HOA's lawyers very soon. That evening, Harold called David. He told his grandson about what happened with Marcus Webb. David was very angry. He said, the HOA could not force Harold to follow rules he never agreed to. He said there had to be some legal protection for people like Harold. David said he was going to do some research. He would find out what rights Harold had. He would look for other people who had fought against unfair HOA rules. He told Harold not to worry. They would figure out how to stop this harassment. But Harold was worried. He was an old man living on a small income. The HOA had lawyers and money and power. Harold felt like David facing Goliath, except Harold did not have a slingshot. The next week brought more trouble. Harold found notices taped to his front door almost every day. Each notice listed new violations. His lawn was cut too short. His garden hose was left out instead of stored properly. His newspaper was not picked up quickly enough from the driveway. Harold realized the HOA was looking for any excuse to fine him. They were watching his house constantly. Every tiny mistake became a violation. Harold started to feel like a prisoner in his own home. On Wednesday, Harold got the worst news yet. A certified letter came from a law firm. The letter said Harold had 10 days to remove the memorial stones and fix all violations on his property. If he did not comply, the HOA would file a lawsuit against him. The letter listed 15 different violations. Some were real, like the peeling paint. Others seemed made up, like improper seasonal decorations for a small American flag Harold had by his front door. The total cost to fix everything would be over $5,000. Harold sat at his kitchen table with the letter in front of him. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million. He did not have that kind of money. Even if he did, Harold was 78 years old. He could not climb on ladders to paint his house. He could not do heavy work to fix his driveway. Harold felt tears in his eyes. For the first time since this whole thing started, he wondered if he should just give up. Maybe he should remove the memorial stones and try to fix what he could. Maybe fighting was not worth losing his house. But then Harold looked out his window, at the stones by his front steps. He could almost see Tommy and Carlos and Jim standing there waiting for him to do the right thing. These men had died for their country. The least Harold could do was fight for their memory. Harold wiped his eyes and made a decision. He would not give up. He would not remove the stones. He would find a way to fight back, even if it seemed impossible. Harold did not know that Marcus Webb and the HOA board were planning something much worse than lawyers and lawsuits. They were about to cross a line that would change everything. Marcus Webb sat in his big office on the top floor of the community center. The office had expensive furniture and a view of the whole neighborhood. Marcus liked to look out the window and see all the houses that followed his rules. It made him feel powerful and important. But when Marcus looked toward Harold Street, he got angry. Harold's house was like a thorn in his side. It reminded Marcus that he could not control everything in the neighborhood. This bothered Marcus more than he liked to admit. Marcus had worked hard to become HOA chairman. He wanted the neighborhood to be perfect. Every house should look the same. Every lawn should be cut to the same height. Every mailbox should be the same color. This would make all the houses worth more money. Marcus owned 3 houses in the neighborhood, so this was important to him. Harold's house was ruining Marcus's plan. People driving through the neighborhood would see Harold's peeling paint and think the whole area was going downhill. New buyers might choose to live somewhere else. This would cost Marcus thousands of dollars. Marcus had tried lawyers and fines and threats. Nothing worked. Harold was stubborn. He would not follow the rules. Marcus needed a new plan. He needed something that would scare Harold into giving up. That is when Marcus got his idea. He would hire security guards to watch Harold's house. The guards would look like police officers. They would have uniforms and badges. Harold would think they were real cops. This would scare him into following the rules. Marcus knew this plan was not completely legal. Private security guards could not pretend to be police officers. But Marcus did not care. He just wanted Harold to move away or fix his house. Once that happened, the fake guards would disappear. No one would ever know what really happened. Marcus called a security company called Titan Protection Services. He had used them before to watch construction sites and office buildings. The owner was a man named Steve Morrison. Steve was not too careful about following rules as long as he got paid well. Marcus met Steve at a coffee shop downtown. Marcus explained what he needed. He wanted 2 guards who looked tough and official. They would patrol Harold's neighborhood and make sure he followed HOA rules. Marcus would pay double the normal rate for this special job. Steve understood what Marcus really wanted, even though Marcus did not say it directly. Steve had done similar jobs before for other clients. Rich people often wanted problems to disappear, quietly. Steve was happy to help as long as the money was good. Steve had 2 guards in mind for this job. Rick Dawson and Jake Miller were both ex-military men who had gotten in trouble for using too much force. They could not be real police officers anymore, but they still liked to act tough and boss people around. They would be perfect for scaring an old man. Steve met with Rick and Jake the next day. Rick was 35 years old, tall and muscular, with short black hair. He had served in the army for 8 years before getting kicked out for fighting. Jake was 42 years old, shorter but stocky with a shaved head and several tattoos. He had been a military police officer before losing his job for stealing. Steve explained the job to them. They would wear official-looking uniforms and patrol a neighborhood. They would focus on one particular house whose owner was not following community rules. Their job was to convince this person to cooperate with the HOA. Rick and Jake liked this idea. They missed having authority over people. They missed the feeling of power that came with wearing a uniform and carrying a badge. This job would let them feel important again. Steve gave them special uniforms that looked almost like police uniforms. The uniforms were dark blue with official-looking patches. They said community enforcement instead of police, but from a distance they looked very similar. Steve also gave them badges that said enforcement officer and looked real if you did not examine them closely. Marcus met with Rick and Jake to give them their instructions. He showed them a picture of Harold's house. He explained about the memorial stones and all the other violations. He said Harold was a troublemaker who refused to follow neighborhood rules. Marcus told them they had authority to inspect Harold's property and make sure he followed all HOA regulations. He said they could issue citations and threaten legal action. He said Harold was probably a little crazy and might need to be handled firmly. What Marcus did not tell Rick and Jake was that Harold was a war veteran. He did not mention that Harold was 78 years old. He did not explain that the memorial stones honored Harold's dead friends. Marcus made Harold sound like a young troublemaker who just wanted to cause problems. Rick and Jake were excited to start their new job. They liked the idea of having authority again. They liked wearing uniforms and carrying badges. They did not ask too many questions about whether their authority was real or legal. They just wanted to feel powerful. Marcus gave them one more instruction. He said they should start by patrolling the neighborhood and getting familiar with the area. They should let people see them and know that HOA rules were being enforced. After a few days, they should focus on Harold's house specifically. Marcus also told them to be careful not to actually arrest anyone or claim to be real police officers. He said they were community enforcement officers with civil authority over HOA violations. This sounded official enough to fool most people, but it was not technically claiming to be police. The next Monday morning, Rick and Jake started their patrols. They drove a white SUV with official-looking decals that said Community Enforcement and Neighborhood Safety Patrol. They wore their uniforms and badges and carried clipboards and cameras. People in the neighborhood saw them and assumed they were some kind of official law enforcement. No one questioned their authority. Most people were happy to see someone enforcing the HOA rules more strictly. Rick and Jake enjoyed the attention and respect they got from residents. People would wave at them and thank them for keeping the neighborhood safe. Children would stare at their uniforms with wide eyes. It felt good to be seen as authority figures again. For the first week, Rick and Jake just drove around and took notes about various houses. They wrote down license plate numbers of cars parked on the street. They took pictures of houses with minor violations. They talked to residents and asked questions about their neighbors. Rick and Jake learned quickly that Harold Thompson was not popular with many of the newer residents. People complained that his house looked old and shabby. They said he was stubborn and refused to improve his property. Some people said Harold was probably senile and should be in a nursing home. By the end of the first week, Rick and Jake felt like they understood the situation. They saw Harold as a cranky old man who was causing problems for the whole neighborhood. They believed they were helping the community by dealing with him. What Rick and Jake did not realize was that they were being used by Marcus Webb. Marcus had painted a false picture of Harold to make them think he was the bad guy. Marcus had also given them fake authority that could get them in serious legal trouble. On Friday afternoon, Marcus met with Rick and Jake to review their first week. They showed him photos of Harold's house and reported on their observations. They said Harold seemed to spend a lot of time on his front porch looking at some rocks by his steps. Marcus smiled when he heard this. Those rocks were the memorial stones that had started this whole conflict. Marcus told Rick and Jake that those stones were illegal decorations that violated multiple HOA rules. He said removing those stones was their top priority. Marcus gave Rick and Jake permission to approach Harold directly. He said they should inspect his property and demand that he fix all violations immediately. If Harold refused to cooperate, they should threaten him with arrest and legal action. Rick and Jake were excited to finally take action. They had been patrolling for a week and were ready to use their authority. They did not realize they were about to make a terrible mistake that would change all their lives forever. Harold had noticed the white SUV driving past his house several times during the week. He had seen the two men in uniforms, but he assumed they were real police officers doing extra patrols. Harold felt a little safer knowing police were watching the neighborhood. Harold had no idea that Marcus Webb had hired fake officers to intimidate him. He did not know that Rick and Jake were planning to confront him. Harold was about to face the biggest challenge of his life, and he was completely unprepared for what was coming. Tuesday morning started like any other day for Harold. He woke up at 6 o'clock, made his coffee, and read the newspaper on his front porch. The memorial stone sat quietly by his feet, catching the early morning sunlight. Harold touched each stone gently, like he did every morning, and whispered the names of his fallen friends. Harold had been thinking a lot about the HOA lawsuit. His grandson David had found a lawyer who might help, but the lawyer wanted $2,000 just to start working on the case. Harold did not have that kind of money. He was trying to decide if he should ask David for help or just give up and remove the stones. At 10:30 in the morning, Harold heard a car door slam in front of his house. He looked up from his newspaper and saw two men in dark blue uniforms walking up his front sidewalk. Harold thought they were police officers at first. Their uniforms looked official and they walked with confidence. The taller man was Rick Dawson, though Harold did not know his name yet. Rick was about 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and short black hair. He looked serious and professional. The shorter man was Jake Miller. He was stockier with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos. Both men wore badges on their chests and carried clipboards. Harold stood up from his chair and walked to the edge of his porch. He wondered if something had happened in the neighborhood. Maybe there had been a break-in or an accident. Harold was always willing to help the police if they needed information. Rick spoke first. His voice was loud and official sounding. He said he was Officer Dawson from Community Enforcement. He said they were conducting an inspection of Harold's property for HOA violations. He demanded to see Harold's identification immediately. Harold was confused. He had never heard of Community Enforcement before. He thought all police officers worked for the city or county, not for the HOA. But the men looked official, so Harold did not question their authority. He went inside and got his driver's license. Jake looked at Harold's license and wrote down information on his clipboard. Then he handed the license back and said they needed to inspect Harold's property for code violations. He said Harold was required to cooperate with their investigation. Harold asked what kind of violations they were looking for. Rick pointed to the memorial stones and said those were illegal lawn ornaments. He said they violated HOA regulations about decorative items. Harold tried to explain that the stones were a war memorial, but Rick cut him off. He said it did not matter what they were. They had to be removed. Jake walked around Harold's front yard taking pictures with a digital camera. He took photos of the memorial stones, the front steps, the mailbox, and the house siding. He was writing notes on his clipboard about everything he saw. Harold was getting worried. These men seemed very serious about finding problems with his property. Harold asked if they had some kind of warrant or official paperwork. He said he wanted to make sure this inspection was legal. Rick's face got red with anger. He said Harold was questioning lawful authority. He said community enforcement officers did not need warrants for HOA inspections. He said Harold was required to cooperate or face arrest for obstruction. Harold did not know what to do. He had never been in trouble with the law before. He did not want to get arrested. But something felt wrong about this whole situation. Harold asked if he could call his grandson David to ask for advice. Jake said Harold could not make any phone calls until the inspection was finished. He said any attempt to interfere with their investigation would result in additional charges. Harold felt trapped and scared. He did not understand why these officers were being so aggressive about some stones in his yard. Rick continued his inspection around the side of Harold's house. He found several more problems to write down. The gutters had some leaves in them. There was a small oil stain on the driveway. The fence was missing one small piece of paint. Rick acted like these were serious violations that needed immediate attention. Harold followed the men around his property, trying to understand what was happening. He kept asking questions about their authority and what law he was supposed to have broken. But Rick and Jake would not give him straight answers. They just said he was violating HOA regulations and needed to fix everything immediately. After 30 minutes of inspection, Rick and Jake came back to the front porch. They had filled out several pages of violations on their clipboards. Rick read the list out loud to Harold. There were 12 different problems they had found, ranging from the memorial stones to dirty gutters to grass that was cut unevenly. Jake said Harold had 48 hours to fix all violations or face immediate legal action. He said community enforcement would return on Thursday to verify compliance. If anything was not fixed, Harold would be arrested and taken to jail. Harold felt his heart beating fast. He was 78 years old and had never been arrested in his life. The idea of going to jail terrified him, but he also could not afford to fix all these problems. Many of them required hiring contractors or buying expensive materials. Harold asked again if he could call his grandson for help. This time Rick said yes, but Harold had to make the call while they were present. Harold called David's work number, but David was in a meeting and could not talk. Harold left a message asking David to call him back as soon as possible. Rick and Jake prepared to leave, but first they had one more demand. They said they needed to inspect the inside of Harold's house to check for safety violations. They said this was standard procedure for all HOA inspections. Harold did not want these men inside his house, but he was afraid to refuse. He thought they might arrest him right away if he did not cooperate. So Harold unlocked his front door and let Rick and Jake come inside. The men spent 15 minutes walking through Harold's small house. They went into every room, including his bedroom and bathroom. They opened closets and cabinets looking for violations. Harold felt like his privacy was being invaded, but he did not know how to stop them. In Harold's bedroom, Jake noticed something interesting. There was an old wooden box on Harold's dresser. Jake asked what was in the box. Harold said it contained some war souvenirs from Korea. Jake demanded to see inside the box. Harold opened the box reluctantly. Inside were some old photos, his army medals, and his service pistol from the war. The gun was a 1948 Colt .45 that Harold had carried in Korea. He had brought it home as a souvenir and kept it all these years. Jake's eyes lit up when he saw the gun. He asked if Harold had permits for the weapon. Harold said he did not think he needed permits for an old souvenir. Jake wrote something down on his clipboard about an unlicensed firearm. Rick and Jake finished their inspection and prepared to leave. They gave Harold a copy of all the violations they had found. They reminded him that he had 48 hours to fix everything. They said if he called any lawyers or tried to interfere with their investigation, they would arrest him immediately. After the men left, Harold sat down in his kitchen chair and tried to understand what had just happened. He felt confused and scared. These officers had been very aggressive and threatening. Harold had always respected law enforcement, but something about these men felt wrong. Harold looked at the list of violations. Most of them were small things that Harold had never thought were problems, but fixing them all would cost thousands of dollars that Harold did not have. And even if he fixed everything else, Harold was not willing to remove his memorial stones. Harold tried calling David again, but his grandson was still in meetings. Harold left another message explaining about the inspection and asking David to come over as soon as possible. Harold needed help figuring out what to do. As the afternoon went on, Harold felt more and more worried. He kept thinking about the threat of arrest. He had never been to jail and did not want to start now at age 78. But he also felt angry that these officers were trying to force him to remove his friend's memorial. Harold walked outside and looked at the memorial. Stones again. He thought about Tommy and Carlos and Jim who had died so young in Korea. They had given their lives fighting for freedom and democracy. How could Harold dishonor their memory just because some HOA officers threatened him? Harold made a decision. He would not remove the stones no matter what happened. If these officers wanted to arrest an old veteran for honoring his dead friends, let them try. Harold had faced worse enemies than angry HOA officers. But Harold did not realize that Rick and Jake were not real police officers. He did not know that they had no legal authority to arrest him or inspect his house. Harold thought he was dealing with corrupt cops, not private security guards pretending to be law enforcement. This misunderstanding was about to lead to a confrontation that would change everyone's life forever. Wednesday night was the longest night of Harold's life. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the two officers who had threatened him. He kept thinking about going to jail and what that would mean for an old man like him. Harold got up several times during the night to look out his window. He was afraid the officers might come back in the dark to arrest him. The house felt different now. It did not feel safe anymore. Harold had lived here for 32 years, but now he felt like a stranger in his own home. By morning, Harold had made his decision. He would not fix any of the violations on the list. He especially would not remove the memorial stones. If the officers wanted to arrest him, they would have to do it. Harold had fought in a war. He was not going to be bullied by corrupt cops. Harold's grandson David finally called back at 8 in the morning. David had gotten Harold's messages and was very worried. He said he would come over right away to help Harold figure out what to do. David arrived 30 minutes later. He was angry when he heard about the inspection and the threats. David said something was not right about the whole situation. He had never heard of community enforcement officers working for an HOA. David thought these men might be fake cops trying to scare Harold. David wanted to call the real police to report what had happened, but Harold was afraid this would make things worse. Harold thought the men might be real officers who were just being paid by the HOA to harass him. If Harold complained about them, they might get revenge by arresting him for something else. David spent 2 hours on his phone researching community enforcement and HOA inspection laws. He could not find any information about officers with that title. He also learned that HOA inspectors were not allowed to enter people's homes without permission. David became more convinced that the men were frauds, but Harold was not sure. The men had looked and acted like real police officers. Their uniforms and badges seemed official. Harold had always trusted law enforcement and found it hard to believe that someone would pretend to be a cop. David suggested they call a lawyer immediately. He said they needed professional help to deal with this situation. David offered to pay for the lawyer himself, but Harold was too proud to let his grandson spend money on his problems. Thursday morning came too quickly. Harold knew the fake officers would be back to check on his violations. Harold had not fixed anything on their list. The memorial stones were still by his front steps. The gutters still had leaves in them. The oil stain was still on his driveway. Harold sat on his front porch, waiting. He wanted to face the officers outside rather than let them come into his house again. Harold wore his old army jacket for courage. He touched the memorial stones one last time and whispered a prayer for strength. At exactly 10 o'clock, the white SUV pulled up in front of Harold's house. Rick and Jake got out and walked up the sidewalk. They looked serious and angry. Harold could tell they were not happy about what they were going to find. Rick spoke first. He asked Harold if all violations had been corrected. Harold said no, he had not fixed anything. Rick's face got red with anger. He said Harold was in violation of a lawful order from community enforcement. Jake walked around the property taking more pictures. He made a big show of documenting that nothing had been changed. He wrote notes on his clipboard about Harold's refusal to comply with official orders. Harold tried to explain that he could not afford to fix all the problems. He said the memorial stones were important to him and should not have to be removed. But Rick cut him off and said Harold's personal feelings did not matter. Rules were rules and had to be followed. Rick announced that Harold was under arrest for failure to comply with community enforcement orders. He told Harold to put his hands behind his back. Jake pulled out what looked like handcuffs from his belt. Harold felt panic rising in his chest. He had never been arrested before. The idea of being handcuffed and taken to jail was terrifying. Harold's legs felt weak and his heart was beating fast. But then Harold remembered his friends who had died in Korea. They had faced much worse things than arrest. Tommy had charged a machine gun nest to save his unit. Carlos had stayed behind to help wounded soldiers even when bombs were falling. Jim had given his life trying to rescue a fellow soldier. Harold found his courage. He stood up straight and looked Rick in the eye. He said he was not going to be arrested for honoring his dead friends. He said the memorial stones were staying exactly where they were. Rick grabbed Harold's arm and tried to turn him around for handcuffing, but Harold jerked his arm away. Harold was old, but he was still strong from years of hard work. Rick had not expected resistance from a 78-year-old man. Jake moved closer to help Rick restrain Harold. The situation was getting out of control. Harold felt surrounded and threatened. These men were much younger and stronger than him. Harold realized he might need to defend himself. Harold broke away from the two men and ran toward his front door. He needed to get inside where he might be safer. Rick and Jake chased after him, shouting that he was resisting arrest. Harold managed to get inside and tried to lock the door, but Jake pushed it open before Harold could turn the lock. Now all three men were inside Harold's small living room. Rick and Jake were both angry and aggressive. They said Harold was making everything worse by resisting. They said he would go to jail for a long time now. Harold felt trapped. His own house no longer felt safe. These men were bigger and stronger than him. Harold was scared but also angry. He had served his country and lived an honest life. He did not deserve to be treated this way in his own home. Harold remembered the pistol in his bedroom. The gun was old, but it still worked. Harold had taken it to a shooting range a few months ago to make sure it was functioning properly. The gun was loaded with bullets from that trip to the range. Harold had forgotten the gun was loaded. He only remembered bringing it home and putting it back in the wooden box. Harold never thought he would need the gun for protection. He had only kept it as a war souvenir and for the memories it held. But now Harold felt like he might need to defend himself. These officers were acting more like criminals than law enforcement. They had invaded his home and were threatening to arrest him for no good reason. Harold had a right to protect himself. Harold told Rick and Jake that he needed to use the bathroom. He said he was an old man and could not hold his bladder much longer. Rick said Harold could go, but Jake would escort him to make sure he did not try to escape. Harold walked slowly toward his bedroom with Jake following close behind. Harold's mind was racing. He needed to get to his gun without Jake realizing what he was doing. Harold was not sure what he would do with the gun, but he wanted to have it available if things got worse. In the bedroom, Harold pretended to stumble and fall against his dresser. The wooden box fell to the floor and opened up, spilling out his war medals and photographs. Jake bent down to help Harold pick up the items. While Jake was distracted, Harold grabbed the pistol and slipped it under his army jacket. The gun was heavier than Harold remembered, but it felt solid and reassuring. In his hand, Harold had carried this same gun through months of combat in Korea. It had saved his life more than once. Harold and Jake returned to the living room where Rick was waiting. Rick was getting impatient and angry. He said they had wasted enough time. Harold was going to be arrested and taken to jail immediately. Harold felt the weight of the gun under his jacket. He was not planning to shoot anyone. He just wanted these men to leave him alone. Maybe if they saw he was armed, they would back down and go away. But Harold was making a dangerous mistake. Rick and Jake were not real police officers, but Harold still thought they were. Harold believed he was dealing with corrupt cops who were abusing their power. Harold did not realize that brandishing a weapon at fake officers could put him in real legal trouble. Harold also did not remember that his gun was loaded. He thought it was empty and only useful for scaring the officers away. Harold had no intention of actually shooting anyone. He just wanted to end this nightmare and be left alone. But sometimes good intentions are not enough to prevent disaster. Harold stood in his living room with Rick and Jake staring at him. The weight of the pistol under his jacket felt heavy and strange. Harold's hands were shaking a little bit. He was 78 years old and had never pointed a gun at another person since the Korean War. Rick was getting more aggressive by the minute. He stepped closer to Harold and said it was time to stop playing games. Rick said Harold was going to put his hands behind his back and come with them peacefully, or they would use force to arrest him. Jake moved to Harold's other side, trying to surround the old man. Jake said Harold was only making things worse for himself by resisting. He said fighting with police officers was a serious crime that could send Harold to prison for years. Harold felt trapped between the two men. His small living room suddenly felt even smaller. Harold could smell the aftershave that Rick was wearing. He could see the muscles in Jake's arms. Both men looked ready to grab Harold and force him to the ground. Harold made his decision. He reached under his jacket and pulled out the 1948 Colt pistol. The gun was black metal with a wooden grip that had been worn smooth by Harold's hands over the years. Harold pointed the gun at Rick and told both men to step back. Rick and Jake froze when they saw the weapon. Their eyes went wide with surprise and fear. They had not expected an old man to be armed. They had thought this would be an easy job of scaring a helpless senior citizen. Harold's voice was shaking but determined. He told the men to get out of his house immediately. He said he was not going to be arrested for honoring his war buddies. He said they could shoot him if they wanted to, but he was not going to jail. Rick slowly raised his hands in the air. His face had gone pale. He said Harold needed to calm down and put the gun away. Rick said they could work something out without anyone getting hurt. But Jake was different. Jake had been in dangerous situations before during his time as a military police officer. Jake was not as scared as Rick. Jake thought Harold was probably bluffing. Jake did not believe a 78-year-old man would actually shoot anyone. Jake started talking to Harold in a calm voice. He said Harold was making a big mistake. Jake said threatening police officers with a weapon was a very serious crime. He said Harold could spend the rest of his life in prison if he did not put the gun down right now. Harold kept the gun pointed at the two men, but his hands were shaking more now. Harold had never wanted to hurt anyone. He just wanted these men to leave him alone. Harold hoped that seeing the gun would scare them away without anyone getting hurt. Rick was slowly backing toward the front door. He wanted to get out of the house as quickly as possible. Rick had not signed up to get shot by a crazy old man. This job was supposed to be easy money, not a life-threatening situation. But Jake was moving in a different direction. Instead of backing away, Jake was slowly stepping to his left. He was trying to get to a position where he could jump at Harold and grab the gun. Jake thought Harold was too old and weak to react quickly enough to stop him. Harold noticed Jake's movement and swung the gun toward him. Harold told Jake to stop moving and get out of the house. Harold's voice was louder now and more desperate. Harold could feel the situation spinning out of control. Jake ignored Harold's warning and took another step to the side. Jake thought he could reach Harold before the old man could pull the trigger. Jake had been trained in hand-to-hand combat. He was confident he could disarm one elderly veteran. Harold saw Jake getting ready to jump at him. Harold's finger tightened on the trigger of the pistol. Harold did not want to shoot anyone, but he was terrified that Jake was about to attack him. Harold felt like his life was in danger. What happened next shocked everyone in the room, including Harold himself. Harold had forgotten that his pistol was loaded. He had taken it to the shooting range several months ago and put the bullets in the gun to practice. But when Harold came home from the range, he forgot to remove the ammunition. The gun had been sitting in his bedroom box with 6 bullets in it all this time. Harold also had not fired the gun in months. His hands were shaking from fear and stress. Harold's finger was on the trigger, but he did not mean to pull it. Harold only wanted to scare Jake into backing away. But when Jake suddenly lunged forward to grab the gun, Harold's finger reflexively squeezed the trigger. The sound was incredibly loud in the small living room. Harold had forgotten how loud guns were when fired indoors. The noise was like a bomb going off. Harold's ears started ringing immediately. The bullet fired into the wooden floor near Jake's feet. Wood splinters flew up from the impact. A small cloud of smoke came from the gun barrel. The smell of gunpowder filled the room. Everyone froze for a moment in complete shock. Harold stared at the gun in his hands like he had never seen it before. He could not believe it had actually fired. Harold had only meant to threaten the men, not shoot at them. Jake jumped backward so fast he almost fell over. His face was white, with terror. The bullet had missed his foot by only a few inches. Jake realized how close he had come to being shot. Rick was already at the front door. When he heard the gunshot, Rick yanked the door open and ran outside as fast as he could. Rick did not care about completing the job anymore. He just wanted to get away from the crazy old man with the gun. Jake followed Rick toward the door, but he was shouting threats as he ran. Jake said Harold had just tried to murder a police officer. He said Harold was going to prison for the rest of his life. Jake said they would be back with backup officers and Harold would be arrested for attempted murder. Harold stood alone in his living room holding the smoking pistol. He was shaking all over now. Harold could not believe what had just happened. He had never meant to fire the gun. Harold had just wanted the men to leave him alone. Harold looked down at the hole in his wooden floor. The bullet was buried somewhere, in the floorboards. Harold felt sick to his stomach. He had never shot at another person since the war. Harold had hoped he would never have to use a gun against anyone ever again. Harold sat down heavily in his old chair. The gun felt incredibly heavy in his hands. Harold's mind was racing with thoughts about what would happen next. The men had threatened to come back with more officers. Harold would probably be arrested for shooting at police, but Harold also felt a strange sense of relief. The threatening men were gone. Harold was alone in his house again. The memorial stones were still sitting safely by his front steps. Harold had defended his home and his friend's memory. Harold did not know that Rick and Jake were not real police officers. Harold still believed he had just shot at corrupt cops who were trying to illegally arrest him. Harold thought he might be justified in defending himself, but he was not sure. Harold also did not know that Rick and Jake were now in serious legal trouble themselves. They had been impersonating police officers, which was a major crime. They had also been trespassing in Harold's house and threatening him with false arrest. The gunshot had changed everything. What started as a plan to scare an old man had turned into a dangerous situation that could send everyone involved to prison. Harold's simple act of self-defense was about to expose a much bigger crime that reached all the way to Marcus Webb and the corrupt HOA board. But for now, Harold just sat in his chair holding his father's old service pistol and wondering what he had gotten himself into. Harold sat in his chair for 10 minutes after Rick and Jake ran away. His hands were still shaking and his ears were still ringing from the gunshot. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Harold stared at the hole in his wooden floor and tried to understand what had just happened. Harold knew he had to call someone for help. The fake officers had threatened to come back with backup. Harold needed to be ready for whatever happened next. Harold decided to call his grandson David first, then maybe a lawyer, and finally the real police. Harold dialed David's work number with trembling fingers. When David answered, Harold could barely speak. Harold's voice was shaky and he kept stumbling over his words. Harold told David that the officers had come back and there had been trouble. Harold said David needed to come over right away. David could tell something terrible had happened. He had never heard his grandfather sound so scared and confused. David told his boss he had a family emergency and left work immediately. David lived 20 minutes away, but he made the drive in 15 minutes. When David arrived, he found Harold still sitting in the living room holding the pistol. David was shocked to see his grandfather with a gun. David had never known Harold to be violent or threatening. David carefully took the gun from Harold's hands and set it on the coffee table. Harold told David everything that had happened. He explained about the inspection and the threats of arrest. Harold described how the officers had forced their way into his house and tried to handcuff him. Harold said he had only pulled the gun to scare them away, but it went off accidentally. David was amazed by his grandfather's story. David had been suspicious of the fake officers from the beginning. Now David was certain they were criminals who had been trying to intimidate Harold. David said they needed to call the real police immediately, but before David could call anyone, they heard sirens outside. 3 police cars pulled up in front of Harold's house with their lights flashing. Real police officers got out of the cars and surrounded the house. Someone was shouting through a megaphone for Harold to come out with his hands up. David looked out the window and saw at least 6 officers with their guns drawn. They were treating Harold's house like it contained dangerous criminals. David realized that Rick and Jake must have called the police and lied about what happened. David opened the front door slowly with his hands visible. He shouted that he was Harold's grandson, and they were both unarmed. David said they wanted to cooperate with the police but needed to explain what really happened. The police officers were tense and ready for trouble. They had been told that a crazy old man had shot at police officers and was barricaded in his house with a gun. The officers expected to find a dangerous criminal, not a scared elderly veteran and his worried grandson. Sergeant Martinez was the lead officer on the scene. He was an experienced cop who had dealt with many domestic situations. Sergeant Martinez could tell immediately that something was wrong with the story they had been told. Harold and David did not look like dangerous criminals. Sergeant Martinez approached the house carefully with his gun ready but not pointed at anyone. He asked Harold and David to come outside so they could talk. Harold was still shaking, but he walked out of his house with his hands raised. David stayed close to his grandfather to provide support. The other police officers kept their weapons ready while Sergeant Martinez talked to Harold. Harold tried to explain what had happened, but he was so nervous that his story came out jumbled and confusing. Harold kept apologizing and saying he never meant to hurt anyone. Sergeant Martinez was confused by Harold's story. Harold kept talking about community enforcement officers who had tried to arrest him for HOA violations. Sergeant Martinez had never heard of community enforcement. There was no such department in their city or county. David stepped in to help explain the situation. David told Sergeant Martinez about the fake officers who had been harassing Harold for weeks. David said the men were not real police and had no authority to arrest anyone or inspect Harold's property. Sergeant Martinez became very interested when he heard about fake police officers. Impersonating a police officer was a serious crime that real cops took personally. Sergeant Martinez asked Harold to describe the men who had threatened him. Harold gave detailed descriptions of Rick and Jake. He described their uniforms, their badges, and their white SUV. Harold also mentioned that they claimed to work for something called community enforcement. Sergeant Martinez wrote down all this information. While Sergeant Martinez was talking to Harold, another officer was searching Harold's house for evidence. The officer found the bullet hole in the living room floor. He also found Harold's pistol on the coffee table. The officer verified that the gun was registered to Harold and was legal for him to own. Sergeant Martinez asked Harold to explain exactly what happened when the gun went off. Harold said he had pulled the gun to scare the fake officers away from him. Harold said he did not remember pulling the trigger, but the gun fired into the floor when one of the men tried to grab it from him. David showed Sergeant Martinez all the threatening letters Harold had received from the HOA. David explained about Marcus Webb and the lawsuit threats. David said the fake officers were probably working for the HOA to intimidate Harold into moving away. Sergeant Martinez was starting to understand the real situation. This was not a case of a crazy old man shooting at police officers. This was a case of criminals impersonating police to harass an elderly veteran. Sergeant Martinez was angry that anyone would do such a thing. While the officers were investigating, Harold's house dispatch received another call. Rick and Jake had called 911 again to report that the crazy old man was still armed and dangerous. They said Harold had threatened to shoot any officers who came to arrest him. But Sergeant Martinez was now suspicious of Rick and Jake's story. If they were real police officers, why were they not on the scene helping with the investigation? Why had they left an armed suspect alone instead of waiting for backup? Nothing about their behavior made sense. Sergeant Martinez called his supervisor to report what he had learned. The supervisor was also suspicious of the community enforcement story. The supervisor ordered Sergeant Martinez to treat this as a case of impersonation rather than assault on officers. Meanwhile, Rick and Jake were hiding at a gas station several miles away. They were panicking about what to do next. They knew they had made a terrible mistake by calling the police. If the real cops investigated too closely, Rick and Jake would be exposed as frauds. Jake wanted to run away and leave town immediately. He said they should disappear before the police figured out they were not real officers. But Rick was worried about leaving evidence behind. Their fingerprints were all over Harold's house. The white SUV could be traced back to the security company. Rick called Marcus Webb to tell him what had happened. Marcus was furious when he heard about the gunshot. Marcus said this was not what he had paid for. Marcus told Rick and Jake to fix the situation quickly and quietly. But it was too late to fix anything. The real police were already investigating. Sergeant Martinez had called the security company that owned the white SUV. The company confirmed that Rick and Jake were their employees, but they were not authorized to act as police officers. Sergeant Martinez also discovered that there was no such thing as community enforcement in their jurisdiction. No government agency had that name. The badges and uniforms that Rick and Jake wore were fake. Everything about their authority was fraudulent. By evening, Sergeant Martinez had enough evidence to issue arrest warrants for Rick and Jake. They were wanted for impersonating police officers, criminal trespassing, and making false reports. The charges could send them to prison for several years. Harold was not arrested. Sergeant Martinez determined that Harold had acted in self-defense against criminals who were threatening him in his own home. The fact that Harold believed Rick and Jake were real police officers actually helped his case, because it showed he was trying to defend himself against what he thought was police corruption. David was relieved that his grandfather would not be going to jail, but David was also angry that the situation had gone so far. David wanted to make sure that Marcus Webb and the HOA board faced consequences for their role in hiring the fake officers. Harold was just glad that the nightmare was finally over. The real police had been professional and understanding. They treated Harold with respect and listened to his story. Harold felt safe in his house again for the first time in weeks. But Harold's troubles were not completely finished yet. There would still be investigations and court hearings. Harold would need to testify about what Rick and Jake had done to him. And Marcus Webb was still out there, probably planning new ways to force Harold out of his home. However, Harold now had something he did not have before. He had the truth on his side, and the real police believed him. The next morning, Harold woke up feeling different than he had in weeks. For the first time since this whole mess started, Harold felt like he was not alone. The real police believed his story. His grandson David was helping him. The truth was finally coming out. David arrived early with coffee and donuts from Harold's favorite bakery. David had been working all night, making phone calls and doing research on the internet. David had discovered some very interesting information about Marcus Webb and the HOA board. David showed Harold what he had found. Marcus Webb owned 3 houses in the neighborhood through different business names. Marcus was making money every time property values went up. Marcus had also been charging the HOA extra fees for his management services. Some of these fees might have been illegal. David had also found other people who had been harassed by the HOA. An elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson had been forced to remove a bird feeder from her yard. A young couple had been fined for parking their car in their own driveway overnight. A retired teacher had been threatened with lawsuit for having the wrong color of flowers in her garden. All of these people were willing to testify against Marcus Webb and the HOA board. David was organizing them into a group that could fight back together. Harold would not have to face this battle alone anymore. At 10 o'clock, Sergeant Martinez called Harold with news about Rick and Jake. The police had arrested both men at a motel on the edge of town. Rick and Jake had confessed to impersonating police officers. They had also admitted that Marcus Webb hired them to harass Harold. Rick and Jake were facing serious criminal charges. Impersonating a police officer was a felony that could send them to prison for up to 5 years. Criminal trespassing and making false police reports added more time to their potential sentences. Their lawyers were already talking about plea bargains. Marcus Webb was also in trouble. The police had obtained a warrant to search Marcus's office and computer. They found emails between Marcus and the security company that proved Marcus knew Rick and Jake were not real police officers. Marcus had conspired to commit fraud and intimidation. The district attorney was very interested in prosecuting this case. The DA said that fake police officers were a serious threat to public safety. People needed to trust real police officers, and criminals who pretended to be cops undermined that trust. The DA promised to seek the maximum penalties for everyone involved. Harold was relieved to hear that justice was being served, but Harold was also worried about testifying in court. Harold had never been a witness in a criminal trial before. Harold was concerned about having to tell his story in front of a judge and jury. David assured Harold that he would have help preparing for court. The district attorney's office had victim advocates who would work with Harold. They would explain the court process and help Harold feel comfortable testifying. Harold would not have to face this alone. 2 weeks later, Harold received some unexpected news. A reporter from the local newspaper wanted to interview Harold about his experience with the fake police officers. The reporter said Harold's story was important for the community to hear. Harold was hesitant about talking to the newspaper. Harold had always been a private person who did not like attention. But David convinced Harold that telling his story could help other people who might be facing similar harassment. The newspaper article came out on the front page of the Sunday edition. The headline read, "Veteran Defends Home Against Fake Police." The article told Harold's complete story from the HOA harassment to the final confrontation with Rick and Jake. The community response was overwhelming. Harold received dozens of phone calls and letters from people supporting him. Many people said they had been harassed by aggressive HOA boards and were inspired by Harold's courage to fight back. A local veterans group invited Harold to speak at their monthly meeting. Harold told his story to an audience of fellow veterans who understood what the memorial stones meant to him. Several veterans offered to help Harold if he faced any more harassment. The American Legion post in Harold's town also got involved. They passed a resolution condemning the harassment of veterans by HOA boards. The resolution was sent to the state legislature with a request for new laws protecting veterans' memorials from HOA interference. Marcus Webb's legal troubles continued to grow. The FBI became interested in the case when they learned that Marcus had used fake law enforcement across state lines. Marcus's security company had operations in 3 different states, and the FBI wanted to investigate whether this fraud was part of a larger pattern. The HOA board finally fired Marcus Webb as chairman. The remaining board members claimed they had no knowledge of Marcus's illegal activities. They hired a new management company and promised to review all pending violations and lawsuits. Harold's lawsuit threat disappeared completely. The new HOA management sent Harold a letter apologizing for the harassment he had experienced. They said his memorial stones were perfectly acceptable and would never be challenged again. The trial for Rick and Jake took place 6 months later. Harold testified about what they had done to him. Harold was nervous on the witness stand, but he told his story clearly and honestly. The jury believed Harold completely. Rick and Jake were both convicted on all charges. Rick was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Jake got 4 years because he had tried to grab Harold's gun and had previous criminal convictions. Both men also had to pay restitution to Harold for the emotional distress they had caused. Marcus Webb's trial was more complicated because his lawyers claimed he never told Rick and Jake to impersonate police officers. But the emails on Marcus's computer proved otherwise. Marcus was convicted of conspiracy and fraud. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and had to pay a large fine. The most important victory for Harold came when the state legislature passed a new law. The law was called the Veterans Memorial Protection Act. It said that HOA boards could not force veterans to remove memorial displays that honored fallen soldiers. Harold was invited to the state capitol when the governor signed the law. Harold stood next to the governor as he signed the bill that would protect other veterans from going through what Harold had experienced. After everything was finished, Harold's life returned to normal, but it was a better normal than before. Harold felt more connected to his community. He had made new friends among the other people who had been harassed by the HOA. Harold was no longer isolated and alone. Harold's memorial stones still sat by his front steps, exactly where they had always been, but now they meant even more to Harold. They honored not only Tommy and Carlos and Jim, but also Harold's own courage in standing up for what was right. David visited Harold every Sunday for dinner. They would sit on the front porch after eating and talk about Harold's week. David was proud of his grandfather for fighting back against the bullies who had tried to intimidate him. Harold had learned something important from this experience. He had learned that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, even when you are scared. Harold had faced down fake police officers with guns and badges. After that, Harold felt like he could handle almost anything. The neighborhood was different now, too. The new HOA board was much more reasonable. They focused on important issues like road maintenance and snow removal instead of harassing people about minor violations. People felt more comfortable in their own homes. Harold often thought about how different things might have been if he had just given up and removed the memorial stones. Harold was glad he had stood his ground. Tommy and Carlos and Jim deserved to be remembered and honored. Harold had done right by his friends. On quiet evenings, Harold would sit with the memorial stones and tell his friends about his day. Harold would update them on how David was doing at work or what was happening in the neighborhood or what he had seen on the news. Harold felt at peace knowing that his friend's sacrifice was still being honored. The stones would stay by his front steps for as long as Harold lived in the house. And if Harold had anything to say about it, they would stay there long after he was gone too. Harold Thompson had won his battle against the corrupt HOA board and the fake police officers. But more importantly, Harold had won the battle for his own dignity and the memory of his fallen friends. That was a victory that would last forever.